called anti-business, actually. He's been called an activist billionaire. He's been called a green tech corporate raider. But for me, I have to admit that 5 years ago, I did hear that TEDx talk on the imposter syndrome, which was extremely interesting, and I'm sure Mike will tell you more about that. But he began it by saying that his priorities when he started out, even pre-Atlassian, were two priorities: not to get a real job, and not to have to wear a suit to work every day. Of course, you're halfway there today. So I do want to start by asking you, Mike, why does renewable energy, why does green tech, why does decarbonization matter so much to you?
That's a very big question to start with. Look, I think it matters to all of us, right? We have to solve this problem, or we're all not going to be here. It's kind of what human beings do. We survive, we grow, we thrive, we move forward. This is the challenge of our era, right? I try not to lay blame in the past. I think it's all the things that we've done as a species to get here. We need to change our fundamental sources of light, heat, motion, all of which are fossil fuel based fundamentally. If you do that part of the problem, you take care of 90% of the challenge. And if we don't, we're not going to be here. So there's not much more of a fundamental problem to attack. It's a source of much frustration for me in a lot of different areas I'm sure we'll get into. I think we have a lot more solutions than we give ourselves credit for. But it's a massive strategic, financial, scientific, an economic challenge involving the tragedy, the commons that is our planet. And so it's, I don't think there's much better things to put my side brain power towards. And so that's what I've sort of got into over time.
Even so, you didn't come to it naturally. You started with software and have worked into this. I'm sure along the way you've met not only those who think that the kind of narrative we heard, for example, on renewable energy in the previous session was unrealistic, and I'm sure you meet a lot of people who are actually downright climate skeptics. What do you say to them?
Well, firstly, I did come most of my life's been an unusual path, but the window has shifted, and it's clear to pretty much everybody nowadays, right? It's not a questionable thing. There's questions you could argue about how fast we should go and how much pain we should take to get there. But in terms of is this the case that we need to do something, it's a non-question. The question about, like, to the previous panel and things, look, I think, I'll put up the top, I think research is really important. I think we need to do some research to look at other ways to solve the very last 5 to 10% of the problem. I would argue we have all the technology we need today, we've had most of it for a long time, to solve well north of 70 to 80% of the problem. And people will say, well, that's not the whole problem, we shouldn't start. No, that's actually the wrong attitude. Let's not forget, the cost of climate action increases every single day, right? In any which way you look at it, it gets more expensive to solve this problem tomorrow than it did today. And it will continue to get more expensive to solve the problem. So if we honestly want to solve it as cheaply and with the least pain possible, that is tomorrow, that is today, that is not in the future. If we get rid of the 70% of the problem that we can do with today's technology, that gives us multiple decades to have more and more technological solutions to solve the really hard, gnarly last 1 or 2% of the problem, which is what people get obsessed by talking about. The bulk of the 70, 80% of the problem, we can solve most of it today. We have the technologies that we need today. We've built them over the last 50 years.
It's interesting, and I do want to come to AGL. And you said publicly, in fact, that your aim was not just to take it over or to improve technology, it was to shut down coal plants. Now, that's fairly drastic. But the truth is, if we look around the world, people are actually moving more towards coal, particularly in the last year, in terms of what we've seen coming out of Ukraine, and the kind of instability around the world, in a sense, is lending it.
Energy consumption. Done right, absent any fingers on scales in the system, that would all be renewables almost everywhere in the world. As you need those new powers, those are the cheapest sources of generation, so that is what you will continue to consume. That in itself makes renewables cheaper, right, because of the modularity and the learning rate of the core renewable technologies in solar, wind, and lithium-ion storage, for example. That's a really good thing, because that actually makes the precipitation happen faster if organised correctly. When you have other interference in the system, that's not quite the case. But I would argue on a strict marketplace system, that will be certainly in the vast majority of countries in the world today.
I think it's important that you say a strict market-based system because, of course, the first wave of renewable energy in India actually had a very hard time because there were stipulated prices for energy which they just couldn't sustain at that time. So I'd like to ask you where you see your business in India moving. What kind of support or cooperation do you see with India? Is it about transfer of technology? Is it about manufacturing? Where do you see your role?
From the point of view of in the decarbonisation businesses or in Atlassian software?
With decarbonisation.
Look, in decarbonisation, I think there's a lot of things we can learn, right? Australia has great experience in renewables, in renewable deployment and other things, and we are going to be doing that at absolutely massive scale in the next 10 years. There's almost no doubt in my mind. How big that scale is, I probably add a zero to what most people would think, but it's going to be a massive scale. So we're going to have a lot of that expertise in Australia, and that requires a whole set of supply chain aspects and other things that, again, we're very worried about having, geopolitical challenges getting away with some of that. What we're lacking is in manufacturing capability in Australia. We've really let that atrophy, and that is something we can learn a huge amount, I think, from India and other similar areas, because when we talk about any of these capabilities in terms of materials, battery processing, when you talk about cables or anything else, what's going to be required in Australia is far more manufacturing capability than we've had, and really an area that we can learn, besides the exchange of talent. So I know of quite a few Australian engineers who have spent time up in India and across large parts of the subcontinent doing large-scale projects, and then come back to Australia. I think that two-way flow of people, experience of building these types of projects is really, really important. I think we can probably also, we have very different energy grids in terms of how they work, both market-based, as you pointed out, and in other areas. That is a source of learning of best practice. Energy grids are kind of a weird thing because they're almost like a singular system. And so they generally move very slowly to change because of the risks to the system. Often the best examples are to look very closely and very deeply at other economies, other grids and how they work. We have a national energy market in Australia, which is it's not unregulated, but the price is free floating, let's just say, every 5 minutes. And it's led to a lot of the advantages that we have in our energy system. And I think there's a lot of things that we can help each other learn about how to run those at large scale.
You did mention geopolitical challenges, so I will ask you that because, of course, Australia is one of the key producers or has the greatest resources of critical minerals, for example. But the processing, the supply chains actually lie to the north of Australia, really in China. As the world grows more polarized, and that's the trend we're looking at. We're not looking at a trend where the world is putting renewable energy and decarbonization ahead of everything else. It's a priority, sure, for businesses, but for countries, but it's not the biggest priority. What we're looking at instead is a much more polarized world. Do you see a problem where geopolitics could get in the way of this renewable future?
I think people are generally aware enough of it. I think there are probably other areas where it would have more impact in the short to medium term, let's call it the next 5 to 10 years. I do think it will be incredibly impactful. In this particular area, there is a huge dependency. It seems like there's a lot of people, there's a lot of possibility to make polysilicon ingots in Australia. There's a lot of possibility to make the higher value manufacturing of some of the materials in Australia, and so we'll continue to do that. What we need to do is just make sure our supply chains are sort of flexible and diverse. We have multiple sources at different points in supply chains. That's a huge problem for me. Certainly in Suncable, we spend a lot of time worrying about that at the moment in terms of the quantum of resources we need over the next 5 to 10 years, and I would argue 20 and beyond as you get to cable 2, 3 and 4, is ridiculously vast. And so you start, working out how is your supply chain going to handle it, etc., which means a lot more management of that over time. Like, much more careful thought is required for that.
Given your experience here so far, do you think the government should be doing more?
Look, I only have I would admit, a cursory understanding of the Indian system, probably maybe deeper than most, but from the point of view of Australia, I could go for 17 hours. I think 2070 is obviously not ambitious enough from what the planet needs, right? So we should start there. It is more ambitious than India has been in the past, which is excellent. And what we've seen over the last 10 years in most of these economies is ambition growing over time as technology costs come down, as risk comes down, as deployments come. So my guess is that 2070 date will start to move in. But any encouragement to do so is a really important thing. Australia has only recently had a 2050 date as of not long ago, less than a year kind of thing. And we could, as a country, be far more ambitious, and I think we will blow away most of the targets that we actually have anyway. And as we've seen in other countries, as you start to achieve, you start to ratchet and move forward. So I would be optimistic. The possibilities in India are incredibly high, right? As I mentioned in some of my remarks before, you know, I think Australia and India are two of the top 10 to 20 countries most affected by climate change, and we're seeing that. So we need to be aware that there's a sort of stick component here where we're like, wow, we both have to really get a move on or we're going to be in trouble. But secondly, we are both countries that have a lot to gain, right? Have a lot of, there's a carrot, there's an opportunity. And I found that in Australia, leaning into the opportunity narrative is far more powerful to actually get people to move than just telling them that they're going to die. Which, you can tell people they're going to die, but guess what? We all would eat cheesecake if that was, you know, we would like be super healthy, et cetera, and they're generally human beings. We're not particularly good at that. That's sort of human nature. So leaning into opportunities and ambition is a much more powerful narrative for Australia. And I think I see a lot of the same quality in India about the possibilities that are here.
Okay. I do want to get to audience questions in just a bit, but I had a couple of questions because you mentioned your plan for Team Anywhere or more. You know, the idea that, do you see the future of work actually somehow improving due to the COVID pandemic or the lessons we've learned? Or do you think we're just going to go back to the same old, same old?
No, I'm a high optimist. I think it's going to improve. I think it's going to be very different. I think it has, I think people, let's say that the course of the future of the work has been dented. It maybe changed radically and then gone back, but I think the shape of the curve has forever changed. I'm a big believer in flexibility of work. Again, Atlassian's Team Anywhere policy. We allow people to come into an office or to work from where they want. It's a choice. But in order to get that choice, to be flexible on where you work, we're very fixed in how we work. So we've just changed. It used to be very fixed in how you work. You had to come to an office, you sat down at this desk, next to these people at these hours. We've made all that flexible, but in exchange, we've changed what we are fixing, effectively. And that has a lot of things around time zones and team construction and travel and all sorts of other bits and pieces. I believe it's a far better equation for employees. It's a far better equation for me. It's a far better equation for society if we can lean into it. I've had a number of conversations here with parliamentarians and politicians from various states in India. And if you are looking at how do you get a rural workforce that is highly paid, this is one of the best opportunities, right? I live in rural Australia. I live in a small farming town. It's not even really a town. And I would not have been able to do that without the pandemic catalysing it, without technologies like Zoom and video conferencing, without decent travel links. I do need to get on a plane and fly here and everything else, so I'm a couple hours drive from the airport, and without amazing internet bandwidth, right? I have two wonderful internet sources, both of whom come through the air now, some from satellite, some locally, terrestrially, at incredibly reasonable cost. But in exchange, I have a far, different lifestyle. I get back hours every day. I take my kids to school. I can pick them up. I can hang out with them at home during the day. I've sort of integrated work and life in a far more, in a far better integrated way, I would argue. And so the time I do spend at work is more productive. It's more focused. It's a lesser proportion of my overall time. And I think you find that story echoed by most Atlassians, right? And we have north of 10,000 people now working from home in lots of different geographies. As I mentioned, we've got staff in 17 different Indian states at the moment. Looking forward to getting to all 28. We now have every state in Australia. We have one person in the Northern Territory now, so tick the last state and territory box. Well, two major territories. I think it changes the nature of work. Now, I'm not going to tell you it's all good. I'm not going to tell you every company's going to go this way. I don't believe that. I believe there'll be companies that are fully local, there'll be companies that are fully remote, and there'll be companies like Atlassian that are hybrid. I would contend that the general, normal curve will trend towards more remoteness and more hybrid if you look at all the companies in the world, especially the bigger ones. And secondly, one important thing to note about certainly all modular renewable technologies, almost all renewable technologies, is they're incredibly CapEx high and OpEx low. So this really comes down to a financing equation, right? What's CapEx high and OpEx low? A house. what did we do? We embedded the mortgage. So financing plays a huge part in this, and not just at the large scale, gigawatt solar farm, at the small scale on a house, on a rooftop. There's a lot of microfinance, for example, to say, look, if you put on solar panels, like the way the equation works in Australia, it takes about 5 years to pay back your solar panels on your house, and that'll last for 20 years. That's 15 years of pure profit. Anybody with a spreadsheet would do that every day of the week, except they don't have the upfront cash. That's where financing comes in, right? In Australia, there's a super competitive market for financed solar on your rooftop that basically takes the payback period from 5 years to about 7 or 8 years after the interest is paid $0 upfront. So basically you've given away 3 years of your 15 years of profit, which you didn't have without the cash anyway, and you've just created 12 years of profit magically. What you've done is lowered your bills, effectively, if you take the net equation. I'm not sure how that is in India. I know I've personally done a lot of microfinance work with communities in India in terms of solar rollout and that sort of thing. But ultimately, I think far more of this is a finance equation to roll out the technologies and to show how it's profitable for a household, a business, an industry to transition over a longer period of time, and then solving finance to actually get that through. That's something we see in Australia. That's why we have, the highest penetration of rooftop solar in the world by far.
So it is true that you started your first business or rented your first office with 10,000 Australian dollars of 2 credit cards?
Yeah, we did. We started Atlassian with about 10,000 bucks in credit cards. Look, I don't recommend it as a strategy. We made it work.
All right, we have a question from SHARAD VERMA from South Asia Times. No. Mine left already. Is Gunjan here? Gunjan? Well, do you want to ask a question? Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm not Gunjan.
Sorry, you're not. I figure.
Here we go. Hi, Sandeep Chandra from the Australia Youth Dialogue, also a proud Atlassian, so thanks for coming out here, Mike. It sounds like from the Sun Cable project, it's currently easier for you to export power to Singapore than Sydney. What is, the AGL play obviously is one hurdle that we can clear. Are there other...
Necessarily easier to send the power to Singapore than it is to Sydney? Let's be clear from what we mean by easier there. It's more economically affordable for us to do that. Singapore has an incredibly high cost of power, has a huge global strategy challenge. So we're talking a lot about global strategy in countries. Australia is a great trading partner with a lot of nations. Singapore-Australia relationship is very key. I think India has a lot of the same opportunities with its nations around in terms of energy export creates regional stability. So it has a very high price of power. It has buyers. It's a highly energy constrained market. So in terms of our first cable, which is the Australian Asian Power Link, it is a logical economic opportunity to build there first. That will reduce the cost of the second cable and the third cable. There are far more opportunities outside of that. Due to the structure of our NEM and our rules around the grid in Australia, that's another reason why it's there. So yes, there's a red tape kind of a problem or regulation problem. That's privatisation. It's a long story. We'll get there. We'll solve that over time.
All right, on that hopeful note, I'd like to thank Mike for maybe after.
Okay, sure.
No worries. Thank you. I'd like to thank Mike for being a great guest, for taking all my questions as well as some of the audiences. And I'd like to call on Parnivel Thiagaraj, the Minister of Finance of Tamil Nadu, to give the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon. Precise and very quantitative analysis of the situation. And thank you, Suhassian, for asking such penetrating questions. I couldn't agree more. I think the technology exists. I think the financing is eminently doable by good grace. I happen to be an engineer and ex-banker myself. So I think Mike's exactly spot on. Let me give you an example of what we're doing in Tamil Nadu. We're already the highest renewable energy state in India. About 30% of our energy comes from wind, solar, hydro. If India is going to get there by 2070, my Chief Minister says we must get there 20 years ahead because we're that much more developed a state. There's a lot of cost reduction, a lot of newer technologies in solar and wind, in offshore wind, in promising technologies like wave. we too have the great luxury of high levels of insulation, relatively large area of land, relatively large coastline. So our ambition is to get to, fully renewable and solve the problem of volatility and variability. What time of the day the sun shines and when the wind blows, with better storage. Storage in batteries, storage in green hydrogen, ammonia, other products.
Should have been fun called to account. So, well, why did you say all these things? Right? They just weren't true. They were straight out false. So it's a very powerful example of how much we can actually when we choose to take action with some of these technologies. But that battery is a perfect example. That was a 150 megawatt hour battery in roughly 2017. Right now, up in the Barclay, we're starting to build a 35 gigawatt hour battery. So that was 3 times larger than we built a 150 megawatt hour battery. We will continue to go. So when we're betting on the future, we shouldn't be betting on today's price cost capabilities. We should be betting on those improvement curves. And there's no better example than in large-scale storage like that. It's going down on a global basis, and Australia's no better example than there, where it's going down precipitously fast, and which is excellent. Not fast enough, but certainly precipitously fast. Secondly, the goal of AGL is not to shut down coal plants. So 140 plus years old, it's one of the oldest companies in Australia. It started as the Australian Gas Lighting Company. It was originally lighting up street lights in Sydney with shale oil gas. So it's been through plenty of technological transitions in its history over that many period of time. And it's a great example to transition itself. And as such, it's been utterly hammered. Right? It used to be a $22 billion Australian company. When I got involved, it was a $4.5 billion kind of story of corporate Kodaking kind of thing. Now, I happen to believe that we should get involved in these companies and change them in a meaningful way. I think it can be an incredibly profitable utility per $1 billion of market cap in the world. It accounts for about 9% of Australia's emissions. Now, if you want a nice emission stat, which I think, and we are accounting for about half of India's emissions with a population that's approximately the same as Mumbai. That's about 40 times emissions per capita. About 1,000 for the emissions of the entire planet. I would argue we can solve the next 8 years just by transitioning this company, and that's why that's my sort of nights and weekends job to try to do that.
Right. The bilateral relationship is about coal. I think $14 billion of the $63 billion that Australia exports of coal comes to India. So the question really, is it then okay to...
Investment. It's not going to be there. So that's why they're not getting funded and built, because there's a negative ROI over the lifetime of those assets. So some part of that will take care of itself. India is already... We have all of the resources required to build like a real renewable energy superpower, and we would still be an energy exporter. We would just export it in very different forms than we have traditionally, but we've made that transition. As I mentioned, with your one sun, one world, one grid. Yeah. So there are 3 fundamental forms that I believe Australia will export its energy. One is directly by cable. Today, it's by far the cheapest way to do it. It's by far the most consistent. It's by far the least lossy in terms of how much renewable energy, and to turn water into hydrogen and other byproducts and export that as a transportable fuel source for things like long distance shipping. It's going to power long distance shipping, but also as an exportable source to lots of other economies. And then third is by higher value exported